Good morning. Thank you so much for coming back to Auto Anatomy. My name is Sean. Today I'm back working on the Corvair and I'm really excited about today's video because we finally get to fix something that has been really bugging me for a very long time. One of the things I noticed from the very beginning of this project was that when you crank up the engine, you get a little bit of smoke that rolls out from the back of the car. And that usually can only come from one place on a Corvair, and that is the pushrod oil tubes. Now on these cars, the push rods run through a little tube that is on the outside of the engine. And you can imagine what happens to a gasket that is 50 years old and exposed to heat and time and age. That O-ring kind of just shrinks and ultimately you'd get a leak. Now most vehicles that wouldn't be that big of a deal because if it just blew a little bit of smoke or just out the back, I could live with that for right now. But it's starting to get cold here. And what's unusual about this car, being an air-cooled car, all of the heat comes from air that is blown across the cooling fins. So when you're riding down the road and it gets a little cool outside, you turn the heat on. Well, right now, you get a big face full of oil smoke. So I can't live with that. So that's gonna get fixed today. I picked up a new Viton oil seal kit from Clark's Corvair. I've never done this, but it looks pretty straightforward. So you and I are gonna learn together today. Before we get started, make sure you smash that subscribe button and hit the bell to be notified when new videos come out. It's an absolutely free way to help support our channel. You can also help support our channel by clicking up there on the little pop-out banner and going to our merch shop where you can pick up cool Auto Anatomy t-shirts like this. Okay, enough talking, let's get started. All right, first thing to do is to get the back end of the car jacked up. I feel like I start every project on this car with jacking up the back of the car. Now with the car up in the air, you can see kind of what the bottom side of the engine looks like. Now the first step of the process is going to be pulling off these exhaust shields, and they're just held in place with like 6 3/8 bolts. There's a couple of more on the passenger side because you've got to pull off this heat shield that goes between the valve cover and the muffler. But again, it's just some 3/8 bolts front and back, and then that should come off. Now, once all the bolts are out of here, there is one kind of tricky thing because here's the little thermostat flap and there's a rod that runs through here and engages a lever on the thermostat flap. So when I pull this down, you can see how that opens and there's that little rod. Now that rod is going to engage on that lever when we put it back together. So it's not a big deal taking it apart. Just be mindful that that's what it is when you have to put it back together. Now that that cover's in place, you can see the pushrod tubes that run through. So you've got an intake and exhaust for each cylinder here. And these actually don't look too terrible. I mean, they're definitely leaking. There's some oil around, but this isn't too terribly bad. But well, you can see a little bit of leaking around them. We're going to replace them regardless. So the next step is, now that we've got the muffler shield off, we're going to have to take off the valve cover, and it's just 4 bolts. Looking inside the valve cover here, it's actually very clean. So this engine doesn't really have a lot of sludge in it. Looking at the rocker arms here, you can see we've got, this is an exhaust intake, exhaust intake, exhaust intake valves. And Clark's recommends doing these one set at a time because you've got to not only pull the rocker arms off, but you've got to pull the studs off. And on these cars, the studs are the head bolts. So that means you're gonna have to re-torque the head bolts when you put the studs back in. And if you do it just one stud at a time, then that minimizes the chance that you're gonna have a leak here. So next, let's just do one set at a time. Let's take the rocker arms and push rods out of one cylinder, keep them in orientation so you don't get them mixed up, and then we'll take the studs off, and then these tubes should slide out this way, just enough for us to get a new O-ring on the end of the tube. Dead battery. All right, this is my intake. And I'm going to set this push rod along with it. Looking at the push rod ends, doesn't look like there's a lot of wear, so that's a good thing. We'll blow these out to make sure that all the little holes in there are nice and open. Take note on these push rods that these are a little bit different. So they've both got a hole in the end, but the end at the rocker arm also has another little side hole. So don't get those in backwards. Okay, now that the rocker assemblies are out of the way, we've got to get these studs off, and then there's a guide plate in here as well. Let's get back to our regular ratchet here, because I sure don't want to break one of those. Okay, it's coming out smooth. All right. One cylinder crisis averted. I don't know why, I'm just a little paranoid about, you know, things like these real long bolts breaking off in the block and then, you know, starting a simple job and turning it into a major job. Something I was a little concerned about, because the stud's supposed to stay in the block, not like that. So now we've got to clamp this and get that off. All right, one more thing to do. You've heard me say it a bunch of times on this car, but there's nothing that a little bit of heat won't fix. All right, another crisis averted. Now on these pushrod studs here, you can see there's a little O-ring seal that unfortunately on this one has turned pretty much into like iron. So these are going to get replaced as well. It did not come out on this one, so we're going to have to go fishing a little bit for it. I think I see it all the way down in there, so just take a little pick and see if we can get that out. Actually, I'm not even sure I see it down in there. This one may have just disintegrated on its own. All right, well, it's going to get one when it goes back together. All right, let's move on to pulling these pushrod tubes out. Now these guys should, with a little coercion, slide back this way. The whole goal isn't to take them out completely. We just want to slide them back far enough so we can get new seals on them. So just barely putting any pressure on these things, the pushrod tube slid right back out. There's a seal right here. See that? There's a seal right there, and then there's an O-ring right at the end of the tube, right there. Those are the ones that are going to get replaced. Well, you know what? It's just as easy to pull the whole tube out. Just notice the orientation in which they go in, and then we'll just slide it right back in. The kit from Clark's comes with all new seals, and it comes with not only the seals for the end of the pushrod tubes, but it also comes with the little small seals that go at the end of the rocker studs. So all we need to do here is just put our new seals on there, just put a little light coat of oil in it, and then slide them right back into the car. Just like that, it's done. All right, one down. Let's move on to the next one. All right, now that both pushrod tubes are in place, we can start reassembling the valve train. I'm gonna have to slide this back in. It's a little tricky because I'm gonna have to start it and then finish running it in with this. It's just, unfortunately, it's suboptimal, but it is what it is. So all I had to do was just run this in all the way until it bottomed out and then just backed it out and the stud stayed in place. So now we finally get to put the rest of it together. Now the way that this works is you've got the stud here, which will go through this guide plate, and then a new O-ring goes on the back of it. Lightly oil that, and then we will slide this in place and torque it back to factory specs. I think it says to start doing it at 10 pounds less than factory specs and then going ahead and torquing it down to its full amount, which on these cars, the manual says 32 to 38 foot-pounds. Now, looking around on many of the Corvair forums, they say 30 is more than adequate because these things have a habit of pulling the studs out of the block and like stripping the threads. So if you only go to 30, then you're gonna be just fine. So we'll start, we're gonna do 10, and then creep up to the third, or excuse me, to start we're gonna do 20 and then go to 30. Okay, now to 30. Okay, next we're going to slide our push rods back in the bores, followed by the rocker and nut for this specific assembly. Again, we don't want to get these mixed up. Now I'm not going to tighten these down yet because we've got to roll the engine over in a specific sequence in order to set the valve lash. All I'm going to do is just make sure that these are all roughly in place. And that's one set of pushrod tubes done. We're going to do the same thing with each set. And just like that, one whole side of rocker tubes is done. But I am gonna clean up some of this gunk down in here just to make sure that, you know, one, because I know it's there, but two, that if it does leak, that I'll be able to see it very clearly. So let's clean that up real quick, and then we'll move on to the passenger side. So now that this little valley is clean here, I can feel comfortable knowing that if it does leak, I'll be able to see it pretty clearly. Now, this side is pretty much done. I'm gonna leave everything apart until we get the other side done so we can adjust the rockers. Now, let's get on to the passenger side. Now, the only thing that's different about the passenger side, as I mentioned earlier, is you've got to pull off this one heat shield, and it's just got a couple of nuts, or a couple of bolts up here, and then a couple of bolts back here. Looking at the valve cover here, it looks like it may have been leaking a little bit, so I'm gonna have to take a look at that gasket while I've got it apart. Looking on the passenger side, you can see it's been leaking a lot more than the driver's side. There's a lot of oil coming around those tubes. So I think this is probably the main source of our problem here, but this is going to be exactly the same as the driver's side. Pull one set at a time off, pull each tube out, replace the seals, put one set back in, torque it in place, and move on to the next side. Now that all of the pushrod tubes are back together and we've got this pretty clean out of here, now we have to adjust the valves. Now the first step in adjusting the valves is setting the engine on top dead center on the #1 compression stroke. So I've got the engine spun around, and I don't know if you're going to be able to see here, but we're lined up on TDC on #1. Now Clark's recommends doing this with the engine running, but since I don't have a valve cover where I can cut the top 2/3 off, I don't want to make a mess and have this thing open with the engine running. So I'm going to do it the way the manual says. And the way the manual says is to put the engine at top dead center on #1 and then adjust #1 intake, 1 exhaust, 3 intake, 5 exhaust, 4 exhaust, and 6 intake. And you'll turn the adjusting nut out until there's end play in the push rod, then turn the adjusting nut in until there's no end play, and then 1 full additional turn. And what that means is I like to spin the push rod in my fingers and keep tightening the nut until I just feel resistance on it, and then turn it 1 full turn more. And I'm just spinning that push rod until right there when it just starts to make contact. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we're going to turn the engine 1 full turn counterclockwise back to top dead center, but it's not going to be on the compression stroke, and then we'll adjust the remainder of the valves. We're back around to top dead center, opposite of our #1 compression stroke. So now we have to adjust 3 exhaust, 5 intake, then 2 intake, 2 exhaust, 4 intake, 6 exhaust. So let's get back to the passenger side and adjust 3 exhaust and 5 intake. Right there. And our last one. Right there. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, all of our valves are adjusted. I'm going to put some new valve cover gaskets on it, and then I've got one more thing to do before putting this all back together again. The last thing that I'm going to do before calling this project a success is I've noticed that there's an exhaust leak on the car, and I've put all new donuts in the exhaust system, but I can't seem to find it. So I'm going to hook up my smoke machine to the exhaust pipe and fill the exhaust system up with smoke, and let's see if we can find where that exhaust leak is actually coming from. Now, I know that the driver's side manifold, one of the flanges was cracked when I got it. I don't think that's it, actually. So let's hook the smoke machine up to it and see what we can see. So if you've never seen a smoke machine, these are fantastic for finding leaks. Basically what they do is they turn like baby oil or something like that into a very, very thick smoke, and you can use it to find intake leaks or exhaust leaks. So what I've done here is I've plugged up the exhaust, as you can see, and now any smoke that we put into it is just going to go into the exhaust system. Now some of it obviously is going to come out the intake valve because we're going to have a valve that's open, but if I do have an exhaust leak somewhere, you're going to see a little trickle of smoke come out. So let's fire this thing up and see if we can make it show us the leak. And here shortly, we should have smoke. It's already starting. I don't know if you're going to be able to see that very well. All right, now let me just plug this in here, start filling up the exhaust system. Already there's a little bitty leak, probably just a little pinhole from the where the muffler was welded on. Nothing yet, but we're starting to see a little smoke come out here. Let's see where that's coming from. Yep, it is the number 5 donut there. This was one that I was kind of concerned about because the little exhaust sleeve is eroded just a little bit right there, and it's not putting as much pressure. I'm gonna turn this off. All right, that was actually kind of a concern because you can see that that exhaust sleeve is eroded a little bit. These are not easy to change out. So that's what it's supposed to look like, that little flange. You can see that one is more eroded. Let me see if I can adjust it a little bit and see if that'll make it seal a little bit better. Otherwise, I may just have to live with a little bit of an exhaust leak. All right, I loosened all these up here and tried to reposition it, and as soon as I tightened it down, since that tube doesn't come all the way down into the manifold like it should, as soon as I tightened it, it cocked just a little bit. So I think I'm just gonna have to live with a little exhaust leak. I mean, it's not bad, it's just a tiny little tick, tick, tick at idle. All right, so let me hammer down the little locking tabs on these nuts first. Then we're gonna fire this thing up because I wanna see if it leaks before putting all the covers back in place. All right, it's all back together. Let's fire it up and see if it leaks. All right, so that's great news. It looks like everything is working perfectly. I don't see any oil leaks so far, but I'm gonna let it run for a little bit longer and see, what we can come up with. But that's a huge step on the progress toward making this thing a reliable daily driver. Listen, if you like this kind of stuff, make sure you hit that subscribe button and click on the bell to be notified when new videos come out. It's a free way to help support our channel, and I really appreciate it. Next time we're going to work on changing out those shifter bushings, which is making it really hard to shift from one gear to another. I'm pretty certain that paper liner in the tube there is completely gummed up, not to mention mud and rust and 50 years worth of gradu down in there. But we've got a brand new bronze upgrade kit from Clark's here, and we're going to change that out next time. Thank you so much for watching. God bless. We'll see you next time. Oh,